too. Yeah, I'm Hannah. It's really nice to meet you. I work with the Public Interest Research Centre, or PIRC, much less of a mouthful, and I'm based in Wales in the west of the UK. And yeah, PIRC's been here for many years, but like for the past sort of decade or so, really kind of honing our work on supporting groups working on like a range of different social and environmental issues, to frame their work in a way that really resonates and connects with the people that they're wanting to bring on that journey with them. And we're still learning loads about what this means. And I'm really excited to like be in the space with you all, as folks really focused in on consumption as a specific like area of our broader climate justice struggle. So yeah, really nice to join you. And I'm really hoping that you all can help me with some of those connections between the broader climate justice framing kind of learnings that we've explored as a crew in the UK, and then how that might be useful for you in your work on consumption. So I'm gonna like share some slides in a moment. And just to say, like, yeah, I'm coming at this very much from quite a broad, very UK specific as well, but a broad angle on centering justice in the work of climate communications. But I think there's loads of parallels and specific like connections with consumption in this. So I hope they're useful to you. Cool. Okay. Bear with me one moment while I do the awkward, clunky thing of trying to share my screen. Like multiple years into remote working post-pandemic times, and this is still hard for me. Okay. I think, does that work? Can you see the slide?
Yeah, it's working. Thanks, Hannah.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Thanks. Awesome. Okay, so just to give you a brief bit of background on the project then. This is the Framing Climate Justice project, which has been a UK-based project working to build a stronger community of practice and coming up with ways to improve how we communicate about climate justice with the UK public as a broad kind of section. And while we wrapped up the initial phase of the project in early 2020, the world, as you know, has since experienced a huge global pandemic, uprisings for Black lives, conflict in Ukraine, a cost of living scandal in the global north, and increased climate impacts around the world, but particularly in the global south. And so I'm going to offer some reflections and questions on where this work kind of stands now in that changed world context from when we first did this. But I'd really love you to like receiving some of this and processing some of this, also ask that question for yourselves, like what of this really resonates now, and what's shifted or potentially changed, and what feels really resonant in the context that you're working in, and what maybe is different to the UK context if you're not based here. I'd also like to be really clear that I'm going to do a presentation with some learnings in it, but it's just a snapshot. This is like a real potted history of the project and what we learned from it. But we've got a bunch of resources available for you online on our Framing Climate Justice website, which, I can share some links for afterwards. We're not going to have time to go into like deep depth today, but I'd certainly love to like scratch into the areas that are particularly interesting to you. But feel free, if you'd like to follow up after this and chat more about it, or if you need some more signposts, just drop me a message. I'll put my email in the chat box as well. Feel free throughout to like jump in, ask questions. You can use the chat box, and I might ask Kate if you could keep an eye on the chat box. I can't quite see it at the same time, and just let me know if there are questions or things that are coming up as we go. That would be really great. Thanks, Kate. But if you want to just jump in and unmute and ask questions in the moment, that's really welcome too. There's no silly questions. All ideas, thoughts and feelings are welcome. Get comfy, and let's jump further in. Cool. So to begin with, I thought I'd briefly introduce the concept of narrative change for you folks, recognizing that for some folks, this is going to be really familiar territory, but for some, it might be newer. I'm just going to start with some kind of definitions, some terminology. Narratives as a term, what do I mean by that? So I guess narratives for me, they play a really critical role in our lives. I think they shape the way that we understand the world and guide our decision making and our behavior. Research around narratives show that they're really deeply embedded in our culture and are present in the conversations that we have, what we see, read, and hear in the media, popular culture, and politics. And the work of narrative change, the work that I'm really deeply invested in, is about creating work that's designed to influence how large numbers of people think, feel, and ultimately act over time. So bending the course of history in favor of justice is the work that I think it sounds like we're all here to do. And for me, that's particularly in the craft of narrative change. So I just thought I'd share this. I really like this metaphor, the waves metaphor. It comes from a great group in the US called the Narrative Initiative, who I'd really recommend, checking out some more of their resources. But just to articulate a bit more about what we mean by narrative at PIRC when we use the term, and how stories, narratives, and deeper narratives interact with each other and shape our societal common sense, our beliefs, and our actions. So we've got the ocean. We've got the waves at the top of the ocean, and right at the top, we've got all of these messages and stories and tweets and newspaper articles and policy proposals and day-to-day episodes of the work of in our lives that toss us around in the waves of society, keeping us disoriented on the ocean surface, focused on each event episode by episode, obscuring the wider patterns and narrative currents that underpin these individual events. So the stories at the surface bring narratives to life by making them relatable, accessible, and even personal. So I'm going to tell you a brief story about sharks just to illustrate what I mean by stories. So 5 swimmers were attacked by sharks along the east coast of the United States in July 1916. 4 swimmers died. As widespread fear and panic grips the nation, President Woodrow Wilson calls an emergency cabinet meeting. A national alarm is raised and forces are sent to hunt the beasts. A story about sharks. Next level down in the ocean, the next level below that, are narratives as a current that sort of flows below the surface, helping to generate those waves at the surface. And narratives are a collection or coherent system of stories that are refined over time. Narratives infuse stories at the surface with deeper meaning, just as underwater currents generate waves at the surface. So here's a familiar narrative about sharks. Sharks are vicious, man-eating predators that frequently attack and kill human beings. They pose an imminent and constant threat. So we've moved from the episode of the shark attack into more generalizing about what sharks are like and their relationship to humans and what we believe they are capable of. And then further below, right down in the depths, and this is the area of work that I'm really into, is the work of deep narrative. Deep narrative. We find at the surface and at the bottom of the ocean all of the values, worldviews, deep beliefs that are bound up in our deep, long-lasting societal narratives. So worldviews are embedded and pervasive in culture. We use them to understand our history and current events, whilst informing identity, community, and belonging. Values and worldviews shape our relationship to sharks. So here's a deep narrative about sharks. Humans and nature are in continual battle. We're defenseless against nature. We fear the unknown. Just let that sink in for a moment. Humans and nature are in continual battle. We're defenseless against nature. We fear the unknown. So that deep underlying set of beliefs about the relationship between humans and nature as a whole, really kind of informing and shaping how we're responding to these shark attacks and the way that we relate to sharks. And then right at the top, the way that we respond and react and act when attacks happen. And we can see, like, you could take this metaphor and you could apply it to all sorts of different social justice issues. And I'll share a blog with you afterwards as well, looking at how the narrative, the deep, deep narratives of white supremacy in society kind of form and interact with our understanding of humans across difference, and how that then informs the day-to-day racist narratives, dog whistle tweets, all kinds of stuff that is keeping us tossed around at the surface and not addressing the deeper beliefs that are causing harm in our society. So there's like lots of different ways of kind of thinking and using this metaphor, but I hope that's useful for you to sort of situate us for the session and like what the work of narrative change kind of means for PIRC. So I'm not going to be doing like loads of talking about how to write the perfect like press release or craft the perfect policy proposal, but the tools that we're going to like explore today are useful for that work, and they are about kind of, you know, really drawing on and understanding like what the landscape, what the ocean is that we're like wading into with the work that we're doing. Cool. And lastly, maybe I'll jump past this one. I've probably dwelt enough, but there's a cute picture of a shark. I'm going to jump on. But this was mostly just to introduce the term framing. So I'll do that briefly as well, which is, it's a craft. It's the craft of what we choose to emphasize, how and what we explain and what we leave unsaid when we craft our stories. So it's the kind of the real doing, the making of the stories and the narrative work. And so you'll hear me, through a lot of this presentation talking about kind of framing tools and techniques. And that is like the craft of narrative change work, is in a lot of these choices that we make day to day. The choices really matter, and they affect how people hear us, what they understand, and how they act. So yeah, incredibly powerful tool. And just one quick caveat before I keep going. And this may already be like very evident to you, but yeah, we basically want to caution that there are limits, and no story or set of words is a surefire shortcut to building social, political, or economic power. So we're not trying to claim that if you use such and such a frame, you will tip the balance of power decisively in favor of climate justice, sustainable consumption. But we think the findings from our project are important, obviously, but we want to remain like realistic in how we present them. So we think this work needs to happen in tandem with, grassroots power building, with policy change work, all kinds of things. And we see them as like deeply connected practices in the work of social change. So, just to summarize, for us at PIRC, we believe that society is built on narratives of our past, present, and future, are the scaffolding of our political systems, social structures, and our own thinking. The old narratives told us that things would only get better. If we work hard, we'll do well in life, and some of us are better than others. They told us that technology would save us from climate breakdown. They told us a lot. And these narratives have failed us. So we need new narratives to help bring new worlds into being. And this is our work at PIRC. And our strategy in particular is to diversify, democratize, and deepen civil society's work on storytelling, narrative, and framing. And we want to make sure the tools for this work are very much firmly in the hands of people most affected by the different issues that we're working on. And so this is a little bit of just a brief set of cute illustrations on why we're doing the work that we're doing at PIRC, with very much a focus on kind of narrative organizing and power building at the grassroots. So that's probably enough context. Let's get into it. Cool. So I've got a question for you to think about, to get us kind of switching into gear. And if you just want to take sort of 30 seconds to a minute, if you've got a pen and paper, or if you want to use the Google Doc that Kate, were you able to share that? Sorry if I've missed that already.
I forgot to share it. Let me do that right now. So this Google Doc we're using throughout the session. You'll see later on there's a table, but at the top there's reflections and questions. But you're welcome to write anything in this at any time. It's for you to use.
Cool, great. So if you want to use that, or if you want to write in your own notebook or wherever, I would love to know, or I'd love for you to have a think about what comes to mind when you think about the mainstream framing to date around sustainable consumption. Up till now, what kind of visuals, what words, what ideas, symbols, phrases, or beliefs come to mind? How has sustainable consumption been communicated in the mainstream so far? And this might be your own practices, it might be practices of organizations, NGOs, governments. But yeah, what comes to mind? Let's take a minute, and if you want to share at the end of that, we'll have a brief moment. But yeah, just a minute to jot down some thoughts. What comes to mind? Okay, just 10 more seconds. Get that last idea down if you haven't already. Okay, so if you'd like to share, what came up for you? What was at the center of the way that sustainable consumption's been framed so far? What kind of visuals, ideas? Yeah, what kind of phrases come to mind? You can share in the chat box, or you can unmute and jump in. I'd love to hear a little bit, the flavor.
Okay. I feel like for me, within the mainstream, I think one of the symbols of sustainable consumption would be a reusable coffee cup.
Yeah, classic. We're going to save the world one coffee cup at a time, right? I'm seeing some nods and some smiles from other folks. What else came to people's minds? I can see Sophie in the chat box. Meat-free Mondays, fast fashion, slow travel, reduce, reuse, recycle, electric cars. Yeah, lots related to, yeah, there's a real range there around our like consumption of transport, of food, all sorts. Anything else?
I'll jump in. This is Zoe.
Hi, Zoe.
I think there's always this narrative of like buy, like continue to buy, but buy sustainably, buy eco-friendly, buy reuse, recycle, buy those products that in a way in their mindset is like, well, if you buy this, that means it lasts longer. But wait, there's still more that we have available for you to continue to buy. So it's just it's like a continued cycle that is just coming at you in your face all the time.
Thanks, Zoe. So no real change of system or practice, just switching one product out for another and continuing the pattern that underlies it. That more, buy, go. Yeah, what else? Anybody else want to jump in? Got Nick Gardner. It's okay, even good to consume, as long as what you buy is made well, or even just recyclable. Thanks, Nick. Cool. That's oh yeah, Calvin, did you want to?
I was going to say the term eco-friendly comes to mind, where they could just when they could just put eco-friendly in front of anything because, well, it might have like 20% recyclable materials in it or something.
Yeah. So the co-option and misuse of like even like labeling things as eco when they may or may not be. Yeah. A lot of greenwashing. There's a hell of a lot of greenwashing. You're not wrong, Janae. Cool. Okay. Well, how about if I switch the word to climate? Let's do this again. Let's take another minute. when you think about climate framing more broadly, we're not just focusing on the consumption angle right now. We're thinking about climate as a whole, climate change, climate as a whole, and the way that we've communicated in the progressive sector about climate. What kinds of visuals, words, ideas, beliefs, phrases, symbols jump out to you? Let's take another minute. Maybe you want to sketch something down. Don't just have to use our words. Harder in the Google Doc.
Did you see the Google Doc, Hannah? It's a lot about polar bears, fires, floods, apocalypse.
Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Yeah. Net zero. Heat waves, often with pictures of cute kids jumping in fountains and eating ice cream.
Interesting. Super interesting. I wonder how much that's come from, like the uptick of heat waves in the past couple of years as well.
Right. Deniers, fossil fuel lobby. 1.5 degrees.
Take 10 more seconds. Get those last ideas down.
Hurricanes. Climate activists, youth climate activists, Extinction Rebellion.
Just a technical note for the people that were writing on below, like on the end of the document. And start to write on the beginning of the document. That we have all the same information in the same place.
Thanks, Yogo.
Thank you. This is great. This is brilliant. Let's pause that there. I'm not going to ask you to share because I'm going to share some with you now. And I feel like Kate's just done a good job of capturing as we were going. But yes, I'm going to see how much there is resonance for what we found when we looked at how climate had been communicated up until the start of this project that we were working on. So for a long time, communications from the mainstream of the climate and environmental movements have been really focusing on emissions targets, individual behavior change, harm to non-human victims like polar bears, biodiversity loss, and technical fixes. There's been a lot of effort put into communicating that climate change is real and bad with appeals to the science. There's not been a lot of effort to communicate the role of exploitative systems, the historic responsibility for climate change, or the unequal impacts on different groups around the world. So looking at those visuals, I'm wondering if you can see some resonance with what you would associate with kind of the mainstream of climate communication. There's work of various different, big NGOs and groups in this, and there's no judgment there. I think there's been a lot of desperation in the climate movement for a long time to try and get change to happen and fast, but not a lot of careful thought about what that means in practice and how we can support people to join in that fight. So in the autumn of 2018, following a summer of very dangerous heat waves in Northern Europe and increasing destabilization around the world, accompanied by media outlets celebrating staycation weather, printing pictures of children playing in fountains, we set about the work of putting global justice into the center of climate framing and amplifying the work of those who are already doing just that, and those who have been doing it for a long time, but who haven't been given the platform, the resources, and the power to drive and direct that work at a larger level. So talking about climate justice can be challenging, as we know. It brings together concepts that are not commonly linked in people's minds: climate change and colonialism, climate change and capitalism, the relationship between these big systems. And it can be uncomfortable to raise the specter of historic responsibility, prompting denialism, defensiveness, as we know. And because it can be jarring to hear about impacts in faraway away places when we have climate impacts happening right here, right now. But in our communications, we need to move on. As we know, we need to move on from simply convincing everyone that humans cause climate change to understanding which humans and which systems. We need to shift gears from persuading people that humans need to act to who needs to act, to do what and why. And so that's what we set out to do on this project. And, you know, we've still got a long way to go, but just to give you an idea of what we covered in the 12 months of this project. Running from 2019 to 2020, we brought together organisers from across the climate movement in the UK to tell the stories that matter and strengthen our movement in the fight for justice. And it wasn't your average framing project. Traditionally, a lot of this work happens in silos, behind closed doors, with very expensive research solutions that get divvied out, dished out with no real power or tools or skills building for the people that need to use them. And that's not what we were here to do. So we worked with collaborators from across the movement, from grassroots, trade unions, think tanks, larger NGOs. And those that were not paid by an organisation to be there were paid by the project, with expenses covered, including childcare, which was funded by larger organizations' contributions. So we did a little bit of redistribution of resource within the movement through this, a little bit of redistributive politics going on in the design. Participants shaped and directed the research and testing that we did, what we asked and how we asked it. And they also shaped our project outputs, which were pitched and voted for by the community and also funded by the project itself. And so with that context in mind, we set the project up to work towards these three aims. So firstly, to strengthen the movement for climate justice, acknowledging a lot of kind of division existed within the climate movement at this point in our journey, and bringing together folks working on social, economic and climate backgrounds, not just with like the environmental work under their belts, to build a shared vision for climate justice. Secondly, we were aiming to better understand how the UK public thinks about justice and justice-related issues, which we hoped in turn would help us to improve our climate justice framing and communications. And we did that through 5 stages of the project, which we outline a more of the detail of on the website if you'd like to hear more about like how we did the project. This is like my area of real interest. I'm our kind of curriculum lead at PIRC. So feel free, if you want to geek out about like how we do this work collaboratively, drop me a line. I'd love to chat, but I won't go into depth now. But yeah, one of the first things that we found, oh, sorry, bear with me one moment. So yeah, when we started embarking on the early stages of the project, the first thing for us to do was really understand where the UK public is at on this, on like the question of justice within climate. But the first thing that we found was that there was a huge research black hole. There's loads of research on whether people think climate change is happening, how concerned you are, your willingness to act, etc. But hardly anyone had done public opinion research or frame testing on some of the key aspects of climate justice, like where people were at on core principles like colonialism and capitalism drove the climate crisis, the most affected are the least responsible, and climate change increases existing oppressions and injustices in the world. And we also found that campaigners tend to assume the worst about public beliefs. They believe that people don't have any understanding or sympathy for these issues, even though there's no evidence to tell us that that's the case. So this project really broke new ground for us in the UK, and gave us more tools to better understand and build more bridges between the campaigning, active, mobilised community and the UK wider public. So we carried out new audience research, including a literature review of 41 sources to understand what had come before us. Found very little, as you know. We also ran focus groups in London, Aberystwyth and Aberdeen. And we did a lot of interviews with folks organising in the movement to understand a little bit more about the blocks and barriers that they come up against in communicating their work. And here's a quick summary of what we found. Summarized in 2 areas. So the first area is about the common ground that we found between our like active mobilized community of organizers and the wider UK public. So we found, these are the areas where there is common ground. And so the first one I'm going to run you through is around responsibility and where people point the finger of responsibility for the current situation that we find ourselves in. People don't really buy the idea that individuals are responsible, interestingly. Yes, we can all play our part, but that part is very limited. Instead, people locate responsibility upwards in government and businesses. There is a catch here, though, because although people have a strong belief in government responsibility, it's also the case that majority of people don't trust the government to act on climate change effectively. So you've got a bit of a conundrum here. The responsibility finger gets pointed, but there's not a lot of belief that the government are capable of doing anything about it, which is going to do the work of really like stopping people from believing that change is possible, right? So there's a block. And it's also like shared in the climate movement in the UK that, you know, that those feelings are shared. The second one, looking at the status quo. So across the focus groups that we carried out, there was consensus that the system isn't working. And this is really, I think, connected to the work of framing consumption. So the damaging areas of the economy that people talked about mostly were energy, food, agriculture, textiles, and transport. So people wouldn't necessarily name systems like capitalism and much less colonialism, but they could talk very fluently about the damaging impacts of consumerism. For example, cheap t-shirts on our high streets coming from Bangladesh, and looking at consumerism and the systems that drive consumerism. And that felt really like comfortable terrain for a lot of the folks that we engaged with. So that's like positive common ground for your cause, your work. And we know that they have, there's a general understanding that consumerism has social and environmental costs, which, this gives us a way into talking about systems, the role of systems in driving consumerism. The next area of common ground was, when we gave people a range of actors and asked who needs to play a bigger role in developing solutions, people say everyone, including frontline and Indigenous communities. But people tend to want scientists and experts to have a bigger role. So there is a sense that we can all step up, but that it should really be expert-led rather than experience-led. So a little bit of difference with the organisers that we were working with, who want to see more experienced leadership and more value placed on people who have experience of building solutions to climate change and adaptation within their context already. But it was a shared area of common ground that everyone needs to play a part in this, and that roles might look a little bit different for different people. And two important new insights. So we explored where people stood on two key climate justice areas. Firstly, when reacting to the statement, the most affected are the least responsible, about half of our survey respondents agreed, but not strongly. So there is some agreement around the historic impact of climate change and how climate change is impacting people now. And then secondly, there was some agreement, particularly from young people, that marginalized groups are most impacted by climate change, and young people chose this group over other, like this collection of groups over other interpretations of who it affects. Older respondents tended to say it affects all of us the same, it doesn't discriminate. So there was some difference around age on that. So that's the common ground areas where there was quite a bit of overlap between public belief and that of the campaigners in the group. And then fault lines, the areas of difference or areas of potential like tension and struggle between the movement's beliefs and UK public beliefs. And this is a chunky slide. It's a real chunky one, and I'm not going to talk it through in full depth. I'm going to highlight kind of three big ones for us that stood out in a moment, but I'm just going to give you a minute to take a little look at this. We've got some key questions down the left-hand side about the nature of climate change and injustice, and then the responses from the movement and the responses from the UK wider public. So take a moment, have a look. And for anyone on the call who's visually impaired, this is all contained in prose in our longer research briefing, which is much more accessible. So yeah, we can share more information after this for the detail as well. So take a minute and then I'll pull out 3 noticeable areas for us. Okay, 3 areas that we found particularly interesting. Firstly, we found a really big difference on whether people believe that we got to where we are in climate by accident or by design. People do not really have a strong sense of historical responsibility for the climate crisis because there's this belief that the cause of climate change were unintentional, that emitting CO2 was an unfortunate side effect of industrialization. This idea of innocent industrialization takes us off the hook historically, because we didn't know the impact of what we were doing back then, right? That's going to be a blocker for looking at kind of just approaches to consumption and who needs to be, like, what would equitable consumption look like if we are to take historic responsibility into account. Like, this was a real area of, kind of difference for the UK public and the movement. I'd be interested to know, if we could do this research again now, I'd be interested to know how much that might have shifted in the context of the Black Lives Matter uprisings, increased like literacy and understanding around colonialism and extractivism. But this is where we were at in 2020. So linked to that very much so, colonialism and capitalism were just not in the picture at the time for people thinking about this in the mainstream UK public. People really struggle to make this connection even when it's introduced. One of the reasons is that people see the climate crisis quite narrowly as a problem of carbon emissions, with impacts like sea level rising and global warming. They also see this as a problem that affects everybody indiscriminately. People don't tend to think about the climate crisis as being linked to systems that exploit particular groups of people and areas of resources and geographies and ecosystems around the world. We have our work cut out to make these links between exploitative systems, historical responsibility for setting them up, and the climate impacts today. And it will take more than a good frame to get us there, but it's work that, you know, is already well underway, and I'm sure there's lots of learnings in the group already about doing some of this. And just from in a British context, but may also be relevant elsewhere, it felt like Britain was largely absent from both the problem and the solution in the way that people thought about it. In terms of the problem, people tended to point to emerging economies like China and India as being most culpable right now, rather than wealthy economies. And in terms of solutions, it seems that people were looking outside the UK for leadership, largely to the US as a country with more power to make change. So that's where we got to with like understanding a bit more about our context. And some of this is still going to be true today, and some of it is definitely going to have shifted. But yeah, I'm wondering what of it resonates for you. We'll have a chance to chat through in a moment. But basically, once we'd like mapped all of this out and got that better understanding, we were much better equipped to get creative with new framing ideas. And so that's what we did. We got to work on creating a bunch of new ideas using lots of different framing tools. So messaging ideas, metaphors, visuals, parallel campaign examples, all sorts of kind of ingredients to help us bridge the differences, the fault lines that I just mentioned, and also to help build on the common ground and really make that common ground grow. I'm not going to share all of that detail with you either today, but I can share what we did play with after this. But this is what we learned from all of that. We went out and did a bunch of testing, on-street interviews, all sorts of like online surveys and different ways of testing out these ideas to see how they landed for folks and whether they helped shift people's like frames of reference, and whether it could bring the kind of emotional journey, the kind of systemic understanding, and the kind of rooting in historic power dynamics that we were really looking to kind of bring into the picture. And here's some recommendations for what we learned works when trying to do that. And this it's not exhaustive. There'll be other ways as well, but this is what we learned. So firstly, we encourage people to explain how climate change multiplies oppression rather than simply stating that it does. Which is a bit of a problem in climate communications in the UK, or in like any justice related communications in the UK. There's a lot of stating of what happens, but not an understanding of how or why. It helps to introduce economic design into the frame using relatable examples and metaphors. And that's because a lot of people have this belief that our economy is a natural occurring phenomenon that we have no control over. But if we can talk about our economic design, the work that's gone into shaping our economy, designing it deliberately, the possibilities for rebuilding, then you give people hope that change is possible. Thirdly, it's important to connect the dots between colonialism and capitalism using those references around economic design. We can talk about historic decisions that were made, and we can talk about the impact of them on design, on creating a world of inequality, in creating systems of extractivism, and in driving consumerism today. But we also found that it really helps to name countries and communities rather than using terms like global north or global south. And I think that's a general rule across the board for like avoiding technical jargon and trying to keep things as real and relatable as possible. We're also emphasizing solidarity with people most affected to help us like build solutions that are rooted in experience as much as in science. We need both. And often those with experience are learning what the reality of trying to adapt to climate change means in scientific terms as well. Next, appeal to self-direction and the values of self-direction and our ability to direct our own lives when talking about affected groups' involvement in decisions. And acknowledge that the problems we have in the UK when advocating for global solidarity and talking about impacted communities around the world make the connection between the local and the global very deliberately. Getting there, we're nearly there. So next is to address people's distrust of government when appealing to government responsibility. Trying to tackle that conundrum that I mentioned earlier on about people looking to the government for responsibility, but not believing that change is possible. I think with good reason for a lot of the challenges that we've had historically in government inaction here. But we've acknowledged that everybody needs to act in this situation. So it's important for us to like support people to see where change is possible and has happened before. Be careful not to rely too much on emergency framing, on crisis, on doom, on emergency, which, we really explored this one in quite a lot of depth because of the rise of Extinction Rebellion at the time. And we were looking at how much the urgency framing of Extinction Rebellion was helping or hindering the cause for climate justice at the time. I won't go into loads of detail now, but I think it is probably relevant on a consumption level when you want to talk about urgency of change. It's very easy to tip people into despair when overemphasizing the urgency of the situation. And that despair is a real inhibitor to hope and to the belief that change is possible. So use urgency and emergency framing with care. And finally, leverage the hope that people do have by sharing examples of change that we've achieved as global peoples in the past, locally, globally, everywhere in between. Find ways of like finding your hope and sharing that with others, and root it in as practical terms as possible. So there's loads more detail on our website and in our research briefing on how we got to these recommendations, but we thought we'd give you a snapshot of them today. That was quite a whistle-stop tour, but we wanted to give you a sense of where there may be learnings for how to frame consumption as a justice issue, where there's kind of overlaps between the two. So yeah, check out the website framingclimatejustice.org, and there's a whole bunch on there, from like a detailed research report to top like messaging guide for top tips for quick messaging needs. There's a webinar that goes into way more depth than I've been able to, and there's some DIY framing worksheets for how to continue to deepen this work yourself within your different contexts as well. So I'm going to pause there and take a breath, and I'm going to pass this back to Kate to open up some discussion.